After a long break, I'm going to do a review of a book which has been incredibly divisive in my own mind. It's like I've got two sets of critics in my mind. I'm simultaneously the love and hate sides of the Marmite of Ulysses by James Joyce. You can see here this excellent cover with the painting, the transmogrifications, there we go, I said it, of Bloom by Richard Hamilton. Who's an artist who's done many works based on Joyce, but I think this is probably the best. Now to why I both love and hate it. I'm sure you've heard the story behind Ulysses, but I'll tell you anyway in case you're incredibly ignorant. It's about Stephen Dallas, who's a pretentious literary student, although I think he's a teacher at this point, but he still acts like a student. And then there's Leopold Bloom, who's a nice, kindly, middle-aged Jewish man, and they kind of do random everyday things for most of the book, and then they meet at the end and have a cup of hot chocolate and go to bed. But each chapter is in a completely different style, apart from the first few, which are kind of similar, and so you can tell you'd have a mixed reaction to a book like that, where one chapter could be written in an amazingly entertaining style, and the next could be written in a dry and horrible style, which makes you want to claw your own eyes out. There's four main kinds of chapter. There's chapters which are similarly underwhelming, not particularly great, but not particularly difficult. Then there's the ones which are also quite easy, but really amazingly good. I will get to those later. Then there's the difficult but horrible ones. Obviously, this gives me most pain reading. I don't even need to say why. And then finally we have the difficult but enjoyable ones. And that may sound like an oxymoron, but be prepared because they're fucking amazing. The most underwhelming ones are the ones that take place near the beginning, kind of describing Bloom's early day, and they're the most homogeneous in style. There's about 4 or 5 of them which are pretty much the same, just the events of Bloom's day punctuated by Joyce's famous stream of consciousness technique. And because everyone has loads of different thoughts, obviously, and they're all over the place, there's some fantastic bits in those Bloom stream of consciousness, but they're kind of hidden, buried underneath a lot of random nonsense. And obviously, with this technique, that's going to happen. But one feels Joyce could have spent more time in making all of his thoughts, no matter how mundane, interesting, and that's not always the case. I mean, it is a lot of the time, because Bloom's a very interesting guy. Even though he's not a genius or dynamic like Stephen, but I found him a lot more interesting because he's just more human. He seems like the kind of person you would meet in real life. The chapters which frustrated me the most were probably, the first one was Aeolus, the newspaper chapter. I was kind of looking forward to it because they had newspaper headings over all the paragraphs. Well, not all of them, but quite regular newspaper headings, and quite a lot of them were humorous. I was looking forward to that because that was the first kind of stylistic change since the novel had started. So, but other than that, really, the headlines were quite good, but the actual chapter was just so mind-numbingly boring, and to be honest, I couldn't really make heads or tails of it either. It was just an incredibly boring newspaperman talking about random events in Dublin, and I had to keep flicking back to the notes page. Thank God I marked that notes page, because I would spend hours looking for the right notes page. So I would advise you to mark the notes page if there is a notes page. If there isn't a notes page, you're fucked. And these events in Dublin that they're talking about, no one could really know about them unless they were alive in 1904, and even when the book was written, not everyone would remember 1904 because it was almost 20 years later. And even then, the book didn't really get into wide circulation, so by the time it was popular, everyone would have forgotten random news events from 1904. As everyone says, Joyce is a bit of an elitist cunt. But I don't mind, because a lot of the stuff he says is interesting, but not this chapter. I wouldn't skip it, because don't skip any of the book. I wouldn't. I'm a bit OCD about that. But don't bother trying to understand it, because it's not particularly experimental. Just the things people say and do are very tedious, and the only difficulty is keeping concentration plus all the events that you don't know about. I'd say the most difficult chapter of the book, and a lot of people say this, is Oxen of the Sun, which is in a maternity hospital, and it's written through the process of the transformation of the English language, and it's not experimental in a particularly enjoyable way, apart from the end, which is full of Dublin slang, and even though I didn't understand any of it, it was quite a joy to read. But the first few bits, first 4 or so pages, it's the most indecipherable English I've ever read. Even though I knew what most of the words meant, it's just the way it's put together is fucking ridiculous. The rest of the chapter was kind of okay, but I was already in a bad mood from reading the beginning, so my concentration wasn't the best. I'll read you a bit now, just to prove my point. Universally, that person's acumen is esteemed, very little perspective concerning whatsoever matters are being held as most profitably by mortals, with sapience endowed to be studied, who is ignorant of that which is the most in doctrine, erudite, and certainly by reason of that in them high minds ornament, deserving of veneration, constantly maintain, when a general consent they affirm that other circumstances being equal by no exterior splendour is the prosperity of a nation more officiously asserted than by the measure of how far forward may have progressed the tribute of a solicitude for that proliferant continuance which the evils of the original, if it be absent, when fortunately present, constitutes a certain sign of omnipotent nature's incorrupted benefication. Okay, I read that rather fast, but you see what I mean. It starts like that. It gets better. I mean, some of the styles are like Charles Dickens and people like that, and obviously I can understand that perfectly well because Charles Dickens is a very easy writer. Overrated, but easy. Another chapter worth mentioning is the penultimate one, Ithaca. It's written in a kind of question and answer form. Apparently it's a satire on Catholic catechism, although I'm not entirely sure what that is because I'm not a Catholic. But Joyce obviously was brought up as a Catholic, being in Ireland, and you can tell he really hates religion because this chapter was almost a pastiche of science and, well, not quite, because you can see he's campaigning for science, he's very pro-science, but it's so overly analytical and logical that you can really tell how much he hates where it comes from, the catechism. And the first 20 pages or so of this chapter were really enjoyable. I mean, there's a part where Bloom is running some water to make a drink, and then it goes through all the different uses of water, and the way it was written, even though it was quite logical, it had a certain amount of beauty to it in the strange links between the different ways of using water. And there was another bit about the different ages of Bloom and Stephen, and if the ratio when they were born stayed the same, then Bloom would have to be like 1,000 million years old or something like that. That was quite amusing. I mean, most people wouldn't find these kind of logic games amusing, but I am a bit weird, as you can probably tell. But after that, the chapter kind of devolved into random, well, it's mainly after Stephen left and Bloom went up to his room and just kind of, oh yes, I've looked at a cupboard and now the page is going to list for half a page what's in the cupboard with no interesting information other than just a description of that. And then it's going to talk about Bloom's different schemes to make money, and then list the train stations which are near the tram line he plans to build for a third of a fucking page. So you can tell what started off well is just a very frustratingly inconsistent chapter, and it left me in a bad mood for Molly Bloom's soliloquy, which is probably the most famous bit in Ulysses. I probably would have enjoyed it more if I wasn't put in a bad mood by the previous chapter. This is starting to be a recurring theme. It's not all bad though. There are some chapters which read really quite easily and are incredibly enjoyable. Probably my favourite easy chapter that isn't in any way experimental particularly, although it's very weird, is the 150-page play Circe. I mean, it was weird in some bits because things just came out of nowhere, but once you accept everything's a hallucination, it's fucking brilliant. I mean, there's a talking soap, a prostitute as a fan, which also speaks. A pair of conjoined twins come out the smoke, and they're a metaphor for drunkenness and soberness, and they're called Philip Sober and Philip Drunk. I've heard it described on a Goodreads review as a psychoskelter. That's a great word, and it definitely describes it, although unfortunately no one goes down an actual helter-skelter. But other than the absence of an actual helter-skelter, pretty much everything happens in this chapter. Another rather interesting chapter was a Nausicaa, which is both beautifully written and quite hilarious in places. It begins with this girl called Gertie, and she's fantasizing about various boys she's interested in, and sees this dark stranger in the distance, and all fireworks are going off, and it's really romantic. And then it reveals that it's actually the fat, middle-aged, and slightly creepy Leopold Bloom. So, bit of a turn for the weird. And then the second half of the chapter is just normal stream of consciousness from Bloom's perspective. And this chapter was quite a nice interlude in all the experimentation. Obviously it's followed by Oxen of the Sun, which is fucking terrifying. But it was nice to have a bit of a break. And I'm definitely rambling. I sound like Cliff Clarvin from Cheers. But ignore that. What's probably the other most difficult chapter, according to most people, Proteus, is actually also one of the greatest and most interesting, in my opinion. It's a stream of consciousness mostly, from Stephen's perspective, but obviously because he's so much cleverer than Bloom, arguably, his stream of consciousness is really fucking obscure and very difficult. I had to go to the notes section a lot, but that is of no consequence. It may be full of pretentious literary references, which with Joyce showing off his knowledge of pretty much everything, but the language is just sublime and so beautiful in this chapter. Probably my favourite chapter in the novel was Sirens, which takes place about halfway through, and it's Joyce's probably his best language ever. I've never read Finnegan's Wake, but out of his first 3 novels, this is where he takes his language skills right up there and dedicates the whole chapter into making it as beautiful as possible. And that kind of sacrifices some of the intelligibility. I mean, a lot of the time you can't tell what's happening, what Bloom is thinking about, if he's thinking about his wife having an affair or some other random shit. But that's true for most of the novel. And here, Joyce just makes it so readable and so beautiful that I don't really care. It sounds pretentious, but what's literature for if not to create beauty? God, I'm starting to sound like a romantic poet now, but it is true. One final thing, one major criticism I have of this and modernism in general is the obsession of literary references and people, James Joyce in particular, and probably by extension like postmodernists, people like Thomas Pynchon, just referencing random shit just to kind of wave it in the reader's face that they know more than you don't. It's not intelligent. It just proves that you've got a high-class posh education who's taught you loads of random obscure Greek myths. I'm all for formal experimentation of other kinds. I love stream of consciousness and all that, because that requires intelligence to understand, not something that can be bought. All these references and this knowledge doesn't require much intelligence to understand. It just requires a more expensive education. It's incredibly elitist. And that's probably my biggest problem with modernism as a whole, and this book in particular. Overall, then, a really divisive novel for me. I think if my brain was cut like that, half of it would be loving it 5 stars, and half of it would be want to throw out the window or set it on fire because it's so difficult and frustrating in parts. That's probably most people's reaction, to be honest. I thought I'd have a really original and cool reaction. I was like, oh, I don't see what everyone's going on about. This novel is piss easy. But it's not. So believe people when they warn you about it. But read it anyway. I'll probably read it at some point in the future, again, when I don't have to read it so quickly, because it's for a course. So I was trying to get it over and done with so I could read books which weren't for a course, and I wouldn't feel like it was necessary to finish it quickly. It definitely needs to be read again. I never really read books twice unless I have to, but I think I probably will here, just to get more out of it, because there's a lot of shit I didn't understand. For now, I'm going to give it a C, because I can't give it higher than that since I hated so much of it. Not because it was badly written, just because it was so frustratingly incomprehensible. Maybe in the future I'll give it a higher grade if I read it again, but for now, a C is the most I can give it. Even though it was definitely not as underwhelming as a C would suggest. It just had too many complex and contrasting emotions from me.